Unit 8.1 or Lesson 8.1 really concerns vocabulary that you already know and a few skills that you already learned. We just need to remind you of those things so that they're clear in your head. It might have been a while since you programmed. So we're going to start with declaring a variable and initializing a variable. And since we're learning Python, that language really isn't the best example of this, because in Python you don't really declare a variable and initialize a variable like you do in most languages. Instead, you just assign the variable a value. We call it assignment, but we probably just ought to call it naming the variable. But let's just pretend. So when you declare a variable, that's when you create it, when you make it. So if you decided to create a variable and just name it, name equals, and then just leave it blank, I suppose that would be the closest that we come in Python to declaring a variable. But the key thing that you need to remember is that declaring is the same as creating. It's making the variable. And it's usually also giving it its type. So in this case, it's going to be a string. We've named it, we've given it a string, we're going to be all cool. Now, initializing the variable would be when you actually assign it a value. So when you take that same variable and you say, here's the name. Now, again, in Python, we usually just do one step. We do naming and initializing at the same time. And it's much more efficient. There are reasons the older languages and other languages do it the other way, but you'll learn about those in advanced programming. For now, just know declaring creates and assigns it a type, and initializing is where you actually assign it a value. So I've written this code, and there's only one problem with it, and that problem is that it's stupid. So it does what it's supposed to do really well. So I define my function, right? Function, called it add2. Number 1 is 5, number 2 is 6. And then I take number 1 and number 2, I add them together, get the answer, and then I print the answer. Now the reason why that's pretty stupid is because if I have somebody who's trying to use my program, they have to be able to code in order to change these numbers. Oh wait, but I wanted to add 24 and 67, and so they have to be able to go into the code to make that change, and that's a pretty ridiculous expectation. So I need some way that I can pass something from here, from my function call, up into my function itself, so that it's more usable. And you'll see as you go forward just how fancy that can actually be. So what I need is these two things. I need them to be definable, and I need to be able to pass them from here up to there. So let's take the same numbers, 24 and 67. Now I got to put those, I want them to be up here. So what I do is I say number 1 and number 2. Now, when I run my code, what happens is it says, okay, run the code, add 2. That's awesome. I'm going to run that code. Stop doing that. I'm going to run that code, add 2. So it comes up here, 24 runs up as number 1. 67 runs up as number 2. Then when my program executes, it says, well, number 1, what is it? Oh, they said it's 24. Good. Number 2, what is it? Oh, they said it's 67. And they add the two together, set it equal to answer, and then print the answer. So it's still 91. But you see now, this is easier to add. So I could do it again, and I could add my 5 and my 6 if I'm really bad at math, but can somehow code anyway. 167 and 890. And you'll see when I run those, I get all 3 answers. Makes it much easier to do the function call. Now, the key thing that you need is you need to know the names for these. So these up here at the top, these are called parameters. And if you'll notice, when I hovered over it, it says parameter number 1, parameter number 2. So the parameters are kind of like the mission, what takes place inside of it, what are the rules that it's going to undergo. And it says parameter number 1, parameter number 2. Okay, and then we have the same thing down here. Oh, parameter number 1, it's going to take whatever number 1 is, and it's going to throw it in there. It's going to take whatever number 2 is. Again, it's going to look up at the parameters. Now down here, when I ask for them, in the function call, those are called arguments. Not that we're arguing, but this is what we're going to put in. So add to. Here are my arguments. It throws them up here into the parameters and then runs the thing. So you need to know where and how to write parameters in your code, and you need to know how to write arguments in your code. So I have here in front of you a very simple program that uses the Pythagorean theorem. Remember from elementary school the Pythagorean theorem, where to find the hypotenuse of a right triangle, you add a squared and b squared, and that gives you c squared. So all I'm doing is I am taking the parameters here. So we're going to pass these arguments up, and then I'm going to square them and add them together. That's going to be equal to c squared. Then I'm going to find the square root of c squared, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Then I'm going to print c. So we're going to find the length of the hypotenuse. And you'll see it's going to work. It's lovely. But, yep, there we have down at the bottom. 3 and 4 are the easiest way to check to see if your Pythagorean theorem works. And 3 and 4 should equal 5, and it does. So it's beautiful. Yay! And we could pass the arguments up. But let's say that we are working with something that's always the same. Let's say that we know always, not always, but most of the time, we know the values of these. We know that this is going to be 3. We know that this is usually going to be 4. So they'll usually be 3 and 4, but maybe not always. These with the equals, these are called default functions. So it defaults to these values. So how do I call that? What do I do? Well, I'm going to just take this off, and I'm going to call the function without any arguments. No arguments. And watch, I hit run, and it comes down, and you have the same answers, 5, 7, and 905. That's because when it doesn't see arguments, it sends that up here, and it's like, oh, wait a sec. Huh. I don't have any arguments. I better use these defaults. So all you have to do to set the default is the variable equal to the default value. And then if you don't pass a value into it, it just works. It uses that value itself. If you do pass a value into it, that value is still going to run as these did.